Former Ontario MPP Roman Baber entered federal politics with his Conservative Party of Canada leadership run, and I interview him to find out why. I'm Élie Cantin-Nantel, and this is CPC Leadership Talks. Hi, and welcome to the podcast. Roman Baber was first elected as the Progressive Conservative Member of Provincial Parliament for York Centre in the 2018 Ontario election. However, his time in the PC caucus ended in 2021 when he publicly challenged Doug Ford's lockdown policies. For the remainder of the legislative session, Roman sat as an independent and received a lot of support from Ontarians and Canadians from all walks of life. Now he wants to become leader of the Federal Conservative Party. Roman, who was born in the Soviet Union, previously worked as a lawyer, having obtained his law degree from Western University. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. And if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, consider adding it to your library. Roman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Élie.
So you were an MPP in the Ontario legislature, and you gained a lot of support after you were kicked out of the PC caucus for challenging Doug Ford's lockdown. So why did you decide to jump into the federal scene with this Conservative Party of Canada leadership bid?
Look, Élie, I think our country is at a crossroads. I'm running to restore Canada's democracy, opportunity, and trust in government. You're right. I stood up for all Canadians when it wasn't popular, and I'll do so, and I'll continue to do so until we restore all rights for all Canadians. I've also been very blessed with Canadian opportunity, and I don't want to see it erode. And I think I'm in a unique position to unite the Conservative Party and bring authenticity to lead it to victory.
When we last spoke, I believe it was last summer for an interview, and you had told me that we had just ended the third province-wide lockdown in Ontario, and you said that we still had a lot of frontiers ahead of us when it comes to restrictions on freedoms. And you were right. Ontario, along with the rest of Canada, was then subjected to a discriminatory vaccine passport and vaccine mandate regime, which you fought against with your Jobs and Jabs bill. However, there are other worries now, especially when it comes to global organizations and some digital technologies, which some of your opponents, like Pierre Poilievre and Leslie Lewis, have addressed. So could you please share where you stand on the WHO pandemic treaty as well as digital IDs?
Sure. So look, first of all, it's important to note that indeed I fought the government's continuous overreach on our rights and freedoms, but not just thumping my chest and yelling freedom, but also articulating a sensible proposition that two shots offer minimal protection against infection. That's according to the chief medical officer. And so the risk of infection is pretty much the same. And that means that no one's risk of transmission is higher by virtue of their risk of infection being higher, something that was thought early on or suggested. So no one's putting others at risk. And Élie, I'm still very disappointed that close to 20% of Canadians are treated like second-class citizens. And we have to continue to fight for every Canadian until every single Canadian has every single one of their rights fully restored. I am concerned, certainly about the prospective treaty. And I know that there is lack of consensus as to what the WHO is actually planning. So now they're negotiating a framework to negotiate. And it's anticipated that they will have an agreement within 2 years. And the agreement will not become adopted by Canada until it's adopted by Parliament. So hopefully by that time, we will have a Conservative majority, and which I anticipate, which I hope to lead, will not adopt such treaty. And if Justin Trudeau or anyone else is still in power, then hopefully we'll repeal it once we form government. But for anyone that's not sure about what is being proposed, I recommend that you read the summary by the London School of Economics, which is a left of center organization. So the left cannot accuse us of suggesting something that isn't there. And the LSC is very clear. The WHO is looking namely for two things. It's looking for to become a greater center. It's looking to center future pandemic response in it. In other words, it will have more say in how future pandemics are going to be handled. And second of all, they are looking for some legal obligations. They're looking for a legal framework whereby countries will commit to the next pandemic response. And that is a major source of concern to me. I don't want to tie Canada into any obligations that are potentially imposed by the WHO. I don't believe it's a democratic organization. I believe it failed our pandemic response with the fact that we now see that the pandemic response, as I've stated earlier, was potentially significantly worse than anyone thought. And I prefer to have an ability for us as a country not to be bound by WHO framework. I note that China was just elected as executive to the executive board of the WHO, and that pretty much tells you what you need to know about the credibility of this organization.
Quickly, yes or no, like, do you support making passports or driver's license digital?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I'm very, very concerned that the ID specifically that the Doug Ford government is developing has room for your medical status in it. And I don't believe that your ID needs to import anything that is personal or unique to you, especially by way of healthcare. I also think it's not out of a question to question government. We've seen, given the erosion of our freedoms in the last 2 years, that it's not far-fetched that government can potentially abuse and disadvantage citizens by having control, essentially digital control of their ID. And also to those that are concerned about, government imposing what's good behavior versus what's bad behavior. We're already doing that, Élie. In the province of Ontario, you go to the bottom of the line for a liver transplant if you've had one too many drinks in your life. You may not be able to get a lung transplant if you're a smoker. So we already punish what supposedly is bad behavior. And that is in a socialized medicine system, which is very, very concerning. And to have this erosion of privacy, to have the government know effectively where we are at all times, and have this type of overreach into our personal life is something that at this point I'm very concerned about.
Yeah, for sure. It's something that concerns me as well. When I first heard about a digital ID, it was before the pandemic, and I thought, great, I have all my credit cards on my phone. I sometimes leave it off my wallet. Like, this would be convenient, but honestly, I haven't seen how the government has kind of, in my opinion, kind of abused their power in the last 2 years. I worry, maybe not this government, but maybe a future government would use this in a harmful way. And I think they've shown us that they don't deserve or the trust that comes with something like a digital form of identification. I want to move on to something that I believe you had said this to Andrew Lawton on True North, that you believed in democratic conservatism. Now, I personally think there are two major flaws to our Canadian democracy. The first one being that voters are only able to hold their politicians accountable at election time. And the second one being that we have a Senate that is made up of appointed, unelected individuals. Alberta's UCP government introduced recall legislation for MLAs as well as municipal politicians, and the province also recently had a Senate election. So are you in favor of national recall legislation for members of Parliament and true Senate reform that would allow Canadians to choose their senators?
Something we have to think about carefully. Imagine if a candidate wins 40% of the vote during a general election, and then you decide that in order to recall them, you need even a special majority, not just a majority of 50% plus one, but a super majority of 2/3. And typically the enthusiasm is with the other side. So wouldn't you have the NDP and the Liberals and the Greens gang up and try to recall every conservative politician in the country? How are you going to protect against that potentially? How are you going to protect against the system being abused? That is not to say that I'm not concerned about the fact that we don't have greater ability to hold government accountable. But I think that we need to be very careful in terms of conceiving this type of legislation, because it will likely be susceptible to use without extraordinary circumstances that sometimes, for instance, we see in the United States when we saw the Wisconsin governor being recalled or the governor of California being recalled. I think that maybe there's something to be said for some certainty in our democracy. The problem is we're seeing unprecedented, remarkable action by government that no one anticipated. And so a lot of Canadians are feeling the acute need to rid ourselves of the current government. This is despite the fact that we only had an election, shy of a year ago. And so what we need to do is we need to focus as a Conservative Party to unite the Conservative Party, to attract voters that have not had faith in our party in the last election. I will attract voters from New Democrats, from the Greens, classical liberals, and win the next election. That's what we need to be focusing on.
That's an interesting perspective on recall. Not necessarily that I agree with it, but I think it's true that we have to be careful, because we don't want activist left organizations threatening elected officials at every vote that they'll be recalled if they don't vote a certain way. I just also wanted to get your thoughts. So Senate reform, do you think it's a good idea to have elected senators in Canada, or should we stick with the current system?
I'll have a conversation with the provinces about Senate reform. I don't want to presuppose what might happen. I fully appreciate perspective of certain provinces that we need to have an elected Senate. I'm actually pleasantly surprised by the Senate after we saw that they refused to go along with the invocation of the Emergencies Act and in fact pushed Trudeau back, causing him to withdraw the bill before the Senate. So I think that certainly there's a case to be had that Canada's Senate has a greater role than we traditionally thought of it to be. And what that is going to look like is certainly something that I'd like to discuss with the provinces. I'm not sure that there's appetite for constitutional reform. I'm not sure that we can reopen the Constitution and come to meaningful consensus, especially when our country is so divided. I think that, Élie, we have a lot of wounds to heal before we can have these type of conversations. And I anticipate, in fact, I already have presented a very viable proposal to unite the West and the East, and especially try to give some comfort to our Western friends. I'm going to turn Canada into the natural resources superpower that it ought to be. I'm going to end equalization and give a tax cut across the board with the savings. Last year, it would have been $21 billion. And I'm going to bring everyone into the national conversation. There's life outside of Ontario and Quebec.
Yeah, for sure. You did touch on unity, so I'm actually going to ask you this question now. It's about Quebec. So you have spoken out against the Legault government and its bills 21 and 96. Now, I understand your concerns about it. A lot of people are concerned about, its effects on, religious minorities or Anglophones. But in Quebec, French Quebec, which is where I am from, these two pieces of legislation are incredibly popular because they represent language rights and secularism. So how do you see yourself, first of all, winning in Quebec and also keeping Quebec with the rest of Canada united when you've said you would support, legal challenges to these pieces of legislation? Aren't you worried that this could perhaps revive the Quebec sovereignist movement if some Anglophones from Canada come in and try to change the laws of the nation of Quebec?
Élie, you live by democracy, you die by democracy. And if we say that we're going to defend the rights of all Canadians, then we have to be intellectually honest and defend the right of all Quebecers, even if that's not popular in Quebec. You know me, and I think I've now developed a reputation that I believe that you don't need to worry about politics. You need to worry about Canadians, and you need to worry about good policy. And hopefully good policy will equal good politics. Look, I oppose Bill 21. I'm an immigrant to Canada, and I love Canada's pluralism. And that's one thing I think that makes our country great. And Canadians shouldn't have to choose between their faith and their ability to put food on the table, just like they don't need to choose a medical procedure versus their ability to put food on the table. And I will defend the right of every Canadian to be open about their faith. Élie, I can't imagine that a Jewish high school teacher that wears a kippah cannot teach high school math, or a Montreal policeman who's Sikh and wears a turban cannot police the streets of Montreal. That is not my Canada, and I will defend them. And Bill 96 scares me even more. We were talking about getting the government out of the doctor's offices because we now have politicized medicine. And Bill 96 seeks to compel doctors to speak in French language, even if their patients do not understand them. Imagine if you have to deliver a difficult diagnosis to a patient and the patient has a lot of questions, and the doctor has to worry about the fact that their office is going to be searched without a warrant, that their life may potentially be ruined. I think it makes for very bad healthcare, and I think it's time that we had a serious conversation about defending Quebecers. And I think electorally, there are a lot of Quebecers that are looking to someone, anyone, to stand up for them. And I intend to be that person.
In the English CPC debate in Edmonton, moderator Tom Clark, despite all his flaws, he did ask a question about Ukraine, and I thought your answer to that was interesting. You had said, you know, you're from the Russian Soviet Union and your mother is from Ukraine, and you said that the only way to end the conflict is to bring both sides to a ceasefire. And I agree with you. Now, while the war in Ukraine, it is a geopolitical issue that may not be around by the time the next election is called if the NDP Liberal coalition stays alive. I did want to ask you, like, if you were to become prime minister, how would you deal with authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in China?
Absolutely. So I think that, first of all, you can't restore democracy abroad or argue for democracy abroad until you restore democracy at home. And right now, Canada's credibility around the world is completely eroded, both because countries can see that our democratic institutions are eroding. They know that we're discriminating, that the government is discriminating against Canadians. They can see that the prime minister is weak. And so I don't think that he can stand up to any leader. I think, however, one is not the same. I think both parties are looking for a way to end the conflict. And you can't end the conflict without ending the conflict. We have to try and get people to the negotiating table, because this catastrophic event cannot continue. We have to get a ceasefire, something for some reason no one is talking about. But that doesn't mean that we cannot be hard on all sorts of authoritarian characters. One way to get there, first of all, is to have energy independence. I intend to turn Canada into a natural resources superpower. But also, I think that we need to stop being afraid. And Élie, if there's one thing that I hope that people have come to understand about me right now, is that I'm not afraid to say it how it is. Yeah. And that means that it's time to call China out. China is stealing our intellectual property. China is locking down healthy people, imposing a humanitarian catastrophe. China is imprisoning its Muslim Uyghur population in camps. And we have to be very, very clear and project moral clarity on how we feel about those things. And I'm going to rally the international community to address this.
I did want to move on now to internal, kind of more partisan issues. Candidate nominations are often inconsistent, unfair, and often don't even happen when it's an incumbent. At the last Federal Conservative Convention, some members had tried to bring forward a proposal to the floor which would have allowed for a plurality of the EDA vote or its membership to veto any decision by National Council or the leader preventing a candidate from running in a nomination or election, as well as the initiation of a nomination challenge if they felt their MP was not representing the riding. So would you support the implementation of such a proposal if you're elected leader? I mean, I know members decide party rules, but like as leader, would you be, in favor of that?
Élie, so you can't restore democracy in Canada without restoring democracy in the Conservative Party. I actually got into this business, into politics, by learning a little bit about elections law. And I'm very well familiar with nominations and party process, something that leaves for a lot to be desired in the Conservative Party of Canada and the Conservative movement at large. and that's why I have released my democratic reform proposal for the Conservative Party of Canada. And specifically, I'm going to end all nomination shenanigans. And that means I'm going to have a preset nomination date for regional nominations. So nobody's surprised. Everybody knows when it is. I'm going to demand that any disqualified candidate receives reasons in writing, and that everyone receive the membership list at the same time. I'm also going to end any whiff of the fact that candidates can be denied the ability to contest a nomination because of their personal views. In the last couple of cycles, we've seen that specifically socially conservative candidates were denied the ability to contest nominations. And while I don't come from the socially conservative necessarily spectrum of the party, I am a democratic conservative, and I'm going to respect the right of every conservative, including a social conservative, including a freedom, a libertarian conservative, environmental conservative, to contest a nomination. That's also how you unify this party, Élie, is by allowing for diversity of opinion within our party. A lot of people want to be heard, and they have the right to be heard and contest a nomination, a fair nomination.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I was a campaign manager for a nomination, and we did win our race. I did feel like it would have been nice for the whole process to be a little bit more unified, a little bit more, normalized, rather than it being a case by case, writing by writing basis. Now, a party that has kind of completely thrown out nomination is Doug Ford's PCs, and I will ask you a question about this. We just had the provincial election here in Ontario, which Doug Ford did win, despite his imposition of some of the strictest lockdowns in the world. When you were fighting against those lockdowns and restrictions, you used the slogan, "Fire Ford, Open Ontario." So I think it's fair to ask, given that you want to lead the federal Conservatives, did you vote for the provincial Conservatives led by Doug Ford in the election that we just had? And if not, why not?
I did not. Élie, I think it's important right now for me to focus going forward on the Conservative Party and to unite the Conservative movement. I still have a lot of respect for a lot of my former colleagues, and I think that a lot of them wish the province well and genuinely wish to do well. I think that the record shows, in fact, that the lockdowns imposed on Ontarians have been catastrophic. Our rate of overdose is almost double. In Ontario alone, we missed more than 350,000 surgeries. We missed more than 1 million cancer screenings. We still have a mental health pandemic. And so I wish that I wasn't correct in my proposal that lockdowns will probably have a greater collateral harm than COVID would have at the time. And regretfully, I'm proven to be correct.
When it comes to the failures of the Ford government, it's not just on the lockdown. There's so many other files, the corruption, the internal bullying. I've heard so many stories of just viciousness, and there's that fiscally imprudence and the failure to stop the woke agenda. There's just a lot that I think from a Conservative point of view came off as a failure. I wanted to ask you a kind of a more personal question. What is one thing that you have learned since you first entered politics over 4 years ago?
Do the right thing and the voters will reward you. That's for sure. When you ask me what I've learned since this leadership race began,
Sure.
I've had a lot of lessons. First of all, you need to be in much better shape if you want to run a leadership race. I got to cut down on the Burger King because
it must be tempting too when you're always busy, you're always on the road,
always on the road, and frankly, I'm a little tired, but I'm looking forward to persuasion right now, assuming we can get the Conservative Party to release us the membership list. The second thing I learned is, and I don't mean to sound like a pandering politician, but Élie, this is such a beautiful country. I drove from Nova Scotia to PEI and then back to New Brunswick. I drove between Kamloops and Kelowna and then Abbotsford and then to Vancouver. And what a beautiful country we have. And finally, one thing I definitely learned during this period, speaking to people across the country, is still how prevalent the issue of Indigenous peoples, how raw and important and sensitive it is to so many people. And that is something that I'm very, very much determined to tackle head on. So be in better shape. You've got a beautiful country, and think about Indigenous peoples and what we can do to improve their lives. Certainly something that I've really learned in the last couple of months.
I think that's a good list. So Roman, thank you so much for coming on. I always enjoy speaking with you, and I always enjoy your authenticity. I wish you the best of luck with the remaining of the Conservative leadership race.
Élie, thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the audience.
And this concludes today's episode of CPC Leadership Talks. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing it with a friend or two. And stay tuned, as I've got more fascinating conversations with prominent people coming soon.